You don't look like your picture. You're not as bearded.
I'm not bearded anymore. My wife doesn't like it. So the beard comes and the beard goes very quickly.
Are you going to do that Movember thing and grow beard and mustache for Movember? No.
Probably not for November. But maybe again before we get out of before we get into the springtime, we'll say.
Okay.
So thanks everybody. John Demore. I'm a president and head of informatics for Diameter Health. Just brief background, we've been working on the examples task force for several years, involved with C-CDA, and company parses a lot of C-CDAs from a lot of generators of that. Tries to use that data for a lot of different ways, and we also generate C-CDAs that consolidate a lot of that content. 80 million lives contracted and hundreds of millions of C-CDAs processed. So that's a little bit background on me. Maybe during the break, we can talk a little bit about something that I shared with Lisa and John and a few other people this morning around the volumes of C-CDAs. It's a lot for it, but my goal for the next little bit, and trying to turn this into action statements, I do have this at the end, is to really come up with some guidance that gives specificity and clarity around how to use authors, performers, informants, and participants in C-CDA sections, and really looking at how to use that in a way that can be helpful. And a lot of these things are not required, certainly, as I'll show in kind of one big table that I'd like to kind of work through today is, and it really is, I think, one of the main outputs of the session for the next 45 minutes or so, is to look by clinical domain and be able to say, what does this mean in this context for it? But that table will show that the vast majority of authors and performers, and certainly informants and participants, are optional in most of the C-CDA sections for it. But what I'll do from an agenda perspective, if I can take about 20 to 25 minutes, and John and Lisa, you can try to keep me honest to this, so try to maybe by 11:45 get done talking. I'm going to go through some stuff, and I think that holding the questions until after that first bolus is helpful, because if I can get through all of it, it helps put the full picture together, and I think might guide some of the conversation or thoughts around this at the end for it. So I'll go over the US CDI and the pressure for data provenance, reviewed some definitions from CDA, the companion guides, and elsewhere. Go to that table, which we'll start off with, but probably end up talking about at the end too, and then go through some examples. I do have the full XML of the examples out on GitHub. None of these have been reviewed or approved by the examples task force, but this is, I'll use that to talk through one story. So that's part of the reason why I want to make it through, is that while there are 4 different examples and 4 different clinical domains, it's really going to be about kind of one story to think about how author and performer and other things are used there, and wrap up with the next steps. So for those of you who don't know, and again, we can really say anything we want about US CDI when Matt Rod's not here. So no, the US CDI 15 kind of core areas for this. So the reason why I've got the kind of red circle around provenance is that's one that really relates to all of the different areas for it, and is something that has driven a lot of adoption within C-CDA about being able to track author information. And while that's not required by the standard by C-CDA, it's often required as part of certification. So it's something that definitely is being done very frequently. However, part of what I want to kind of open the dialogue around today is that there might be roles and benefits to other types of participants within tracking these different sections. So you can think about the author that you could have for a problem, or the author you could have for a vital sign. You can also think about the performer you might have for a problem, or the performer for a vital sign, or the performer for a laboratory result. And that's really what I'm going to be speaking about today. In terms of definitions, I will just kind of read it a little bit that's on the slide here, just to kind of set the framework for it. What I did is I took the CDA, so going back to the CDA base standard R2, and put in their definition as best as I could, kind of just copy it out of there. And then I also put in the definition that's in the companion guide, trying to do my best to get what's in there. And then, part of the feedback that I get in preparation for the section is that it would be helpful. We're not going to try to talk about anything about disambiguating, figuring out fire stuff or fire data provenance today. That's not on the scope of what I want to talk about, but it would be helpful to think about that fire data provenance as well, just because the definitions are often very similar, but sometimes slightly nuances in terms of what you've got there. So if you think about the author, represents the human and or machines that authored the document or section or entry or act. That's kind of added in there because it kind of refers back to the document level in the definitions within CDA. From the companion guide, it's the author that represents the human or machine that authored content. And from fire data provenance, one nice thing that they did that the CDA and the companion guide didn't do is that it didn't use the word to describe the definition for it. So for author and data provenance of fire, a party that originates the resource and therefore has responsibility for the information given in the resource and ownership of the resource for an author. So slightly different way to think about author, kind of not including author in the definition there. For performer, CDA says a person who actually and principally carried out the action. For the companion guide, it's a performer. Participant represents a clinician who actually and principally carried out a service. For fire data provenance, very similar person, animal, organization, device that actually principally carries out the activity for it. So this is just getting started here. The two other ones, certainly there are other things that we could define, but the two other ones we'll talk about today are just participant and informant. So participant, I really should have put participant last here, so maybe we'll do informant first. An informant or source of information is a person that provides relevant information, such as a parent of a comatose patient who describes the patient's behavior prior to the onset of the coma. Companion guide doesn't directly give a definition that I could find for informant, but I think that that's a pretty descriptive one from CDA, and data provenance and fire is pretty similar there. A person who reported information that contributes to a resource. For the participant in CDA, it's kind of like a catch-all, so used to represent other participants not explicitly mentioned by other classes that were somehow involved in the documented acts for it. And the companion guide doesn't really cover that, and fire data provenance doesn't really, as far as I can see, and someone can say, but doesn't really have that kind of a generic kind of catch-all for a participant. So that's just a little bit on the definitions here. I'm going to work to kind of keep myself on time, get my clock on my other screen. CDA allows, this is just one thing I want to make sure, everyone probably already knows this on the phone, so I apologize for repeating things that people know, but CDA allows for all four participation types that were on that prior slide of performer, author, informant, participant. In the base schema really of essentially most of the ways that you package information within an entry. So an act, an encounter, an observation, an organizer, procedure, or substance administration being the most common ones for that. And they're all there, they're always there for all four of those in the base standard. And the order is always performer, author, informant, and participant. And they're all right next to each other, essentially kind of in the order from a schema perspective of what they're putting in there. The order doesn't mean anything, it's just the order that CDA puts that out from a schema perspective. The reason why I mention this is because on the next slide, which gets to that table, you'll see that in some parts of the C-CDA, things are explicitly called out. They say an author goes here, and like author participation is a very common thing that's used in a lot of sections. Sometimes they don't say that a performer is there. So like for an allergy or problem, you don't generally see a performer. You can put it in, certainly, because it's part of the base standard for it. And I think one of the other things that could come out of today is examples that we could move forward about how to use performers in different sections. We do have some examples of that already out there, which were in some of the prior examples that were shown in the Confluence page prior to today. So here's the big table. I'll go through the legend first. Author participation. So as part of C-CDA 2.1 and as part of meaningful use and the usage of documents that said that you had to track the author in the last modified time, this idea of author participation, which was a separate template, but essentially is just an author, was encouraged or included in most of the clinical domains within the entries, really within the act or encounters or observations. It was referred to, and it's a should for it. So essentially, you should do that. Now, as part of certification of EHRs, they actually make sure that you often are doing that because that kind of makes sure that you can comply with the US CDI or what was formerly Common Clinical Data Set of being able to record that information. Then in pink here, I have just the element is explicitly mentioned in C-CDA. Again, from the prior slide, obviously, all of these can be used in all these different clinical domains for it. But you'll notice some places where they're just not explicitly called out here, like allergies and problems don't explicitly call out using the use of performer for it. Doesn't mean you can't use it, just means that it's just not kind of something that was called out explicitly in C-CDA. The shall conformance is really pretty limited. So actually, Giorgio talked a little bit about this in the last session, that the allergen is a participant within the allergy or an allergy intolerance observation. And then payers use performers and participants explicitly through being able to get information on the payer, the guarantor, or the member, patient, subscriber type information for it. But essentially everywhere else on this chart is something that it's optional by a may or should type basis for inclusion in there. So what I'm going to do is we're going to run through those 4 examples. The first example will be a problems one. The second example will be a medication one. The third example will be a vital signs one. And then the 4th example will be both a planned observation and also then a result, essentially kind of an order for lab and then its results coming back for it. What we have down here kind of in the matrix here, so all these can be used in all these different domains for the matrix here is kind of what does it mean to have a performer, an author, informant, and participant. Now, informant's pretty simple. There's not really any variation as you go down that one. And the author is also pretty consistent with one exception maybe around the results for it. The way that I was working on it, which is trying to think about not defining the author as the person who authored it, to try and say, what could be a way of defining that in a way that doesn't use the word author. I like the idea of who originates the record for it. It's similar to kind of who originates the content, but a little bit different because the content kind of implies like who first did this. And really, authors in a lot of context of data provenance really refers to who's documenting this and this record today for it. Who's putting that out there. So that's in all the sections. The only addition to that is you can also use author within results to kind of have a slightly different meaning, which is, for an example, when somebody is going ahead and providing an interpretation for like a radiology, like a commentary interpretation for what they see in imaging of an echo or a CT scan, an MRI, et cetera. That can be an author within there too. Certainly that person is also generally a person who originates the record for it, but has slightly kind of additional meaning because there might be authors that don't necessarily have that within the results section as well for it. So when I put the and sign here, it just means that it's used in, it could have kind of carry different roles within there. It doesn't have to mean one that has both of those for it. So within results, I mean, it could be an or too if you think about the other way, but within results, you can have an author who just originates the record recording that this was your glucose at this time or something like that. Or you could have the person who's providing interpretation reading who's obviously also kind of originating the record for it. The interesting one here to talk about today is this first column, which is performer. For allergies and for problems, we've begun to move towards this idea that it's kind of who diagnosed and maybe also who manages those things. So like who's managing diabetes might be the performer, and also who originally diagnosed that the patient was a diabetic could be a performer. Within procedures and vital signs, it's a little bit more straightforward. Kind of who performs it in a procedure. It's often a surgeon. In a vital sign, it could be just whoever's performing the vital sign. For results, we have an example out in the CDA examples task force that the results has who performs as being the lab or an imaging center. The reason why this one becomes important is that if you want to track the time that a result is actually completed, this has actually become really important as part of COVID stuff because there's a big lag between when you collect the nasal specimen and when you actually have it completed or resulted. You can actually have the performer time associated with that. And then you can look in the other sections for what that means as well. Within medications, it would be who administers or prescribes the medication for it. For participants, really the only one that's of interest that I think about here is the where performed, which is both in the encounters and the procedure section, which is the service delivery location as a template that uses participant to say where things were done. So jumping right into the examples and keeping on time here, I got about 12 minutes before I'll open up for the floodgates of questions or discussion around this. Patient Johnny accident is seen for the first time by doctor at emergency for fainting in the ER. So that's going to be the first line for a lot of the examples, kind of setting up this. The doctor at emergency finds external documentation that Dr. Mary Primary diagnosed Johnny with diabetes last year. So not the problem that we're talking about here is diabetes, not fainting, but obviously could be related because maybe the patient's hyperglycemic and that's what's happening. So for the diabetes diagnosis, doctor at emergency might want to put that in the record because that's obviously relevant for why the patient's here. Who's the author of that diagnosis? Who's the performer of that diagnosis? And then what times go in the act, observation, effective time, and what times go in the author and performer time. So this plays a little bit off of also stuff that Giorgio talked about today for it. I've got the full example and the web link to all of them right on the slides for it, but they're also in the Confluence page. I've just for brevity, I've kind of omitted a lot of XML here, so I'm just going to focus in on a few things. Within the act concern wrapper, you'd have a load time of effective time, which would be when that was first documenting locally, which is when it became a concern to that local record for it. Again, not necessarily that this is well used right now, but that could be what that means. The entry relationship, the observation effective time is the date of biological onset. So patients here today in the ER, so kind of all this takes context as of today, October 21st. You want to document the diabetes and it's a concern locally here. The biological onset date would be basically when that external documentation said that the patient actually became a diabetic, which was August of last year for it. The performer of this could be who actually diagnosed that patient. So you could have Dr. Mary Primary down here. I didn't show all of her name and contact details. That's in the example online, but I have a time value here of August 27th of last year. And then the author would be when it was recorded, which really would marry up to the act effective time low here for when that was recorded, because it's when it became a concern locally. So that's one usage of author and performer within a problem. Next one is for patient Johnny accident being seen in the first time by doctor at emergency for fitting the ER. The doctor finds external documentation that Dr. Mary Primary prescribed insulin for Johnny last year. For the insulin medication entry, who's the author, who's the performer, what times can go there for this information. So here we would have an entry and a substance administration. The mood code here would be EVN because this is a medication history. The time the medication was started would be down in the effective time low. And then the performer in this instance would be who prescribed, which would be sometime before the medication was started. So looks like she prescribed this back in December 12th last year for this. And then, but the author of this would be when it was recorded again locally, who originates this record, if you think about that, which would be again today that this is being authored in this local record. And I put kind of an assumption down here that doctor at emergency has confirmed with the patient that they're still taking that insulin for this. So that's why they're putting it down here. Example 3 is one where the roles could be reversed, certainly for it. But for this one, a physician's assistant measures the blood pressure for the patient is entered in the EHR by doctor at emergency. For the blood pressure, who'd be the author, who'd be the performer, and what would happen if information was provided. I actually don't have this one answered, but I think that this goes to that idea of informant. What would happen if this information was provided by somebody else? So within this example, we would have a vital sign entry with an organizer, has an effective time. At the organizer level, because there can be multiple components to blood pressure, there are generally 2 in C-CDA, systolic and diastolic. You could have other vital sign readings. But at that organizer level, you can have a performer, which would be Paul Assistant here, who is the one who actually took the vital sign readings, and an author could be at emergency. The roles here are not distinct to the roles or the kind of licensure of the clinicians here, which is it could be inverted the other way, which is maybe the doctor performs it and someone else puts in the EHR. But that would be a way of tracking who performed the vital sign and who authored it. And often this could be the exact same person. So don't want to say that this has to be different for this information. It's just trying to hold this out through examples that they could be different for this information. And part of the value that we'll talk about of this is that if this information was to flow in the future downstream, there might be more consistency around the performer. And if that information was put into other EHRs at some other time, the author might get more authors, or it might only have the more recent author for that information. And again, at the component observation effective time levels is where you actually have the time of the biological observation, which probably, I think I probably need to amend this one. It should just be an effective timestamp here. It doesn't need to be an interval for a blood pressure reading. Last example here is patient Johnny accident is seen by the first time by emergency. Doctor orders a metabolic panel for which the blood is drawn today. The lab is completed by high quality labs tomorrow. Who is the author of the order? Who is the performer for the lab once performed? And then how is the reporting time recorded? And how do these things get linked together for this? So this is the kind of last example here, kind of rolling into the last 5 minutes before I open it up. In this instance, it could be very valuable to know who placed the order. And one way to do that would be to have a planned observation within a plan of treatment, to have an entry where you could have an observation with the mood code of our QO, to have an ID associated with that, and an effective time, which is when they plan it to get done. This was an ordered stat, so they just say that this can be done tomorrow and resulted. And the author for this would be when that order was placed, which again would be that same time of kind of today when the patient's in front of you in the ER. Once that information is resulted, you would see an entry within the results section. That would be a result organizer with a result observation here. The organizer could have a performer. That performer could be the lab, so high quality labs, and also the time that lab has resulted. So you see the timestamp on here is tomorrow, even though the effective time of all the observations is going to be from yesterday, because that's when the blood was collected for it. Now, of course, effective time has different meaning when you do imaging and other things for it, but effective time is kind of the biologically relevant time for the observation, not the time when it's completed, which is, I think, including performers within lab results is a very valuable way to be able to collect reporting time when there's a reason to do so. And then within here as well, we can also have the template for an entry reference that would actually have an entry relationship and an act. I've, again, for simplicity, kind of simplified this and didn't put all the context conduction and all the class codes associated with it. Those are all out there in the example on GitHub. And an ID. This ID would then have a way of connecting this lab result back to the planned observation for it. Interestingly, because you can't put an entry relationship at the organizer level, if you want to use that entry reference template that's out there in C-CDA for doing this relationship, you do need to put it down at the observation level for that information. So this was one of the real ones I wanted to get to. If I could kind of think about one of the examples that I really want the most would be that we'd all agree, and I think that there's an example out there that you could have performers be the labs that complete things, and that's kind of how to document them, and also to have that time associated with this. So Andrew, I'm going to go for 2 more minutes, and then I'm going to open it all up, but we'll go to you and other people first here for it. So the reason why I wanted to finish all this is I think that this gives a little bit of color when you think about things over time and what this might mean for things. So if you think about these 4 examples, the top one was that diabetes. Diabetes started last summer, and then the patient was diagnosed. The person who diagnosed became the performer, and today you have an author. The person who prescribed the insulin became a performer. Today you have an author of that information. This can be something that's done at the same time for like that vital sign. The performer and the author really at the same time. Could be the same person, could be different people. And then the author and the performer for this. When you order the metabolic panel, you get an author for that planned observation. And then when it gets resulted, you could have a performer. So there's been a lot of focus on authors. But I think that if you kind of look at the time series, there's kind of an interesting role that'd be applied across multiple domains for performers, which is performers are a way to say who did this, and it's a little bit less mutable, or I want to say it's immutable, but it's a little bit less mutable. Whoever performed the surgery is kind of there forever. Whoever performed the vital sign is kind of there forever. Whoever resulted the lab is kind of there forever. The authors of that information, though, could certainly change over time as that information gets recycled and put into different records and information, or kind of, again, forward thinking a little bit. You think about resources and fire. You might have multiple different places that the same content gets stored with different authors, but the performers are a little bit less mutable from that context. So this kind of is the points for discussion. But before I jump into these guys, I'll stop and kind of open it up for people to ask some questions. I know Andrew had one, probably a couple people might have their hands raised.
Yeah, so a couple of slides back there, you had the example of like the lab order situation. So this one, yeah, the lab is ordered and you've got the entry with the ID route highlighted there. And then you've got the completed lab result observation with the same ID route. I guess my question is, and this is something, that's always kind of bugged me, is, we're sending our lab orders out on a V2 interface with an order ID, and then we go and create the CDA, and we have to generate an ID route for that lab order. It's not going to, it may not match what was generated for the ID route on a CDA that was generated on a different system, perhaps for the ordered lab on that same order. I mean, I think it's great, to try and be able to say, oh, we've got a consistent ID route here for an order that was placed by a physician, but because we don't use the same process to assign these IDs when we go from one standard the V3 CDA to V2, even fire, potentially, we're not maintaining a consistent reference identifier as we go from system to system and everything. So is that an important piece of this in your mind?
I think that's a really good question. So just one observation, there obviously can be an ID at the organizer and at the observation that, could be generated lots of ways. This is the entry reference template, which is an entry relationship that refers back to the order. But I think you bring up a really important point, Andrew, which is, could you be using things that might be able to tie to accession numbers or things like that? When you think about like the V2 to V3 world, so that there was some ties between different systems for it. I think that that's a really good way to think about how that might play into ID elements. I haven't tried to solve for that here. I mean, it's a really good question though, in terms of thinking about how to track something over time and relate back to it.
That was exactly, Andrew, what I was looking at. I mean, that's the first thing that caught my eye was, how are we going to tie those two back together? When it get into the database. And I completely agree with you that there is a disconnect functionally within the EHR itself, in a way to get this represented in CDA and how it gets represented in CDA.
Yeah, I'd love to be able to maintain that and carry that forward. And I mean, when I'm generating it out of my system, I try to be consistent, but
yeah.
When it's coming from another system or whatever, I can't guarantee, that it's always going to be the same number.
In the EHR,
Andrew,
they do tie them together with their session number, but how is their session number represented in CDA? That's the whole disconnect between, the workflow in the EHR and trying to translate that into CDA.
I think that in FHIR, we have business identifiers different from IDs. And I'm wondering, later today, we'll be looking at the alternate identifier extension that just was recently added that has to do with more explicitly representing certain roles where there is an ID that you can, we'll show examples of that. The extension was not positioned to be able to be used inside acts like observation and organizer, but maybe the wheels will start to turn and we might think about that. I think this is a great example of a business need for why it might be interesting to have an identifier, not just an ID, for some of these act classes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
even
that
if
other
you
one.
did,
Go ahead, Linda.
oh, it says I was mute. Well, am I muted?
No,
No, we can
No,
hear
we
you.
can hear you.
So I think that I was thinking about about the placer and filler. The placer order number I think could be an ID with a root where the actual for the practice where the extension is the placer order number, and then that could tie back out down entry relationship. And then there's the filler or the accession, which it could be an ID, but like you said, Lisa, it's how do you know what that ID means without this new extension? My question, was on the same slide, if I could ask it while you're here.
Yep, go ahead.
And I was concerned about the fact that, again, it's a V2 to CDA, but in V2, you can actually have a resulted time for every observation. And then the OBR, I think, is like the last updated, if I remember correctly, or something like that. So that correlates to me with the performer and that time up there. But it feels like I would want to know the dates and time resulted in the observation too, thinking about things like cultures and.
Yep. You could definitely do both. I mean, there's nothing preventing you from putting the performer within the observation as well. The reason why I was thinking about it up here is that it saves a little bit of time, and often it is the same for one order. You have one time stamp
Sure.
associated with it. But no, you could put it up here at the organized level. And then if you have it more specifically for something down, you could put performers down here. So you could put in both. You have to think about what the time would be up here. It might be more of an interval rather than a timestamp at that point. Or you could just put it down at the observation level. And technically, the example that we have today is at the observation level for a performing lab. So I think either way is good. I think the thing that I think is of value is to know that resulted time, which is, it's kind of like the missing element in a lot of CDA lab results, which is,
Yes.
the biological relevant time, but virtually nowhere do you ever get those OBR and OBX segments that refer to the resulted time.
I think it would be good to have a comment, John, just to note, because a lot of times people don't know that it's possible to do things in both places without a comment that indicates that. I wanted to make a comment on this slide also before we move. May I go next?
Popular slide.
John, you said that you put the entry relationship for this this entry reference template down at the observation level because you couldn't put an entry relationship on an organizer. And I just pulled out my handy dandy RMIM diagram, and it doesn't look that way to me. Have we thought about whether it would be actually better to put the entry relationship to that act, the template that's for your relating back to the planned observation, to put that entry relationship on the organizer?
No, I don't think you can do that. If you look, I think it says there's a rule in there somewhere that says the organizer clone can be the source of the component relationship or the reference relationship, but not the entry relationship. That little gray box where it says constraint organizer points to constraint organizer.
Yeah, I was looking at it here, Lisa, that the element sequence didn't allow for an interrelationship. But
You know what? You're right. It's in, I have a little handwritten note that says, organizers can't be a
Organizers
source.
can't contain interrelationships. It's
Yeah,
actually right in
yeah.
the RMM. It's a gray box that points to organizer.
The printout that I have is missing that gray box.
Ah.
Hey,
Defective.
can you
Okay,
drop the
thank
link
you.
for where you're looking at the RMM?
Well, it's
I
in the
was-
downloads. It's
In
in the
the spec.
downloadable. I don't know if I can. I don't know if you'll be able to
You
get it.
get it
without
out of the
actually
CDA,
downloading.
out of your CDA package.
Okay, so it is
Download
that
package.
one. I think that's
Yeah.
the printout I have too, but I went to find it and I couldn't.
Okay. I had a question about the slide where you show the picture with everything kind of put together, and I was wondering if where you have the lab resulted, you had. Well, I'll start on.
You mean the
It's okay. I'll start here. I
Okay.
have a comment on this one too. So on this slide, for medications, for payers where you've got payers and guarantors, medications where you've got who administers or who prescribes, and in the spot where you've got the ampersand in results, would you be open to modifying the slide so that you say who administers, comma, who prescribes? For the payer, you put commas between them, payer, comma, guarantor, and for the result, you say who originates the record, comma, who provides the interpretation and reading, just to make it clear that it's like two different sort of roles that the performer could be semantically talking about.
Yeah, no, and I was, oops, gonna have to futz around a little bit with
Yeah,
formatting.
you don't have
I
to
know,
do it right now, but I think that would just be a minor improvement that would make it clearer.
Yep, no, I think that probably would be better.
Yeah, and get rid of the ampersands to make them comments and commas, and replace repeat the who when you have multiples. And this comment then relates to, as I was thinking through that, your final picture where you put the whole ER scenario together. I think that lab resulted has both a performer and an author.
And that's a good question, which is, I mean, I don't see a lot of labs with authors, but could.
Because, I'm some V2 message is pumping that thing from the lab back to the EHR, and either a device or a person is entering it into the record. And whoever that is, be it the device, some system that's doing it automatically, or a person who's looking and then swiveling their chair and recording it in the record, is the author of that lab result.
Mm-hmm. Because I can take that off as a question mark, but I mean, I agree that you could definitely have that. I was more just trying to call out the different ways that they play together in this one. So I've only got one more slide to kind of have the discussion points here. So I think we're kind of wrapping up. And of course, we can make all the decisions around data provenance while Matt's not here. So I'm just kidding. Author, I'm being recorded, so I shouldn't kid, but authors record the last hop for it. Authors from prior hops can also be included, but they're not required from a data provenance perspective, which is you don't necessarily need to know all the hops of the data to conform to data provenance. As I understand it, this is my opinion, it's not ONC's or HL7's for it, but this kind of ties to the idea that, authors could be a lot of different places and different things for it. Performers end up being a little bit more static. So authors are permanent for a record or a resource, but they may not be maintained always as information flows into other systems. Performers are more permanent more generically. Performers may be the earliest author in some contexts for it. And then patient-generated content means, and this is one thing that relates to this informant aspect, patient-generated content means the patient is the author. So if you're using your personal health record and you're putting stuff in there, you are the author of it. But generally, when you think about a patient or a guardian in respects to an EHR, and they're providing that information to a clinician who's authoring it in the EHR, that becomes an informant when that information comes from another source, but then is entered into a legal record by a clinician or someone else who becomes the author for it. I just wanted to see if anyone disagreed with any of these points for it. So I think that there's.
John, the only one that I was confused on is in terms of performers and believing that everything you've got there is true, and I agree, is on the slide where you had medications. You showed a substance administration in mood code EVN, and you talked about prescriptions. And for the life of me, I still am troubled by the semantics here to say, how do I not believe that this is telling me that someone gave this medication? I can't see semantics that says this is a prescription versus this is actually record of an administration of the med.
Yeah, I mean, from a RIM perspective, mood code event means this is recording the actual administration. So
Right. It should be intent or request.
it would be
Okay, so this one might not work then.
And we
Because-
tend
Well,
not to have-
I don't know. I think if you semantically got the top part worked out, and what I can't remember is for some reason I believe there's this complexity that if it's a prescription, it's actually a supply in mood code RQO. Then the performer would in fact be the prescriber. But right now I'm having trouble saying that performer is the prescriber, when what it looks to me is like that performer is the person who administered a med.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, is that with this, if you are, I mean, the performer is not it could be a doctor, obviously, but that's the person who did the administration, the author, of course, being the person that recorded it. So it's, how do you differentiate the prescriber? You'd almost need to have a link from this back to the RQO, the order, and that would be, the author of that would be the prescriber. And
wouldn't that thing that's in RQO, wouldn't that be a supply rather than a substance administration?
No, it's a request for an administration. Prescriptions, I mean, it depends on your place, but prescriptions tend to have, if you look at the V3 model, it has both a request for substance administration and a request for supply. That's the outpatient world, but normally in the inpatient world, it would just be a request for an administration.
Yeah.
This looks like Dr. Primary was the one that gave the shot.
Exactly.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. No. I get the. I'm wrestling with this whole. How do you say, you want to say medication statement because you want to say the patient's on insulin? How do you say who prescribed it? Does it have to be a link back to something else?
There should be another section here that also has the medication prescription.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it has to be in the V3 space. It has to. You'd be at this event, and then either the RQO with the link to the events, or an event with the link back to the RQO.
Okay, so this one doesn't work.
Nope.
All right.
I mean,
I think
it
you're on the
works,
right
but
track.
it's
I think you're
not
on the right
showing
track.
what you want it to show.
Yeah.
Yep.
It does work. It is saying this is the person who prescribed. This is the
No,
person
Who administered. This is the
meant-
person who administered.
Yes.
All right.
doesn't
So
do what you
that
thought.
one I'll need to play around with a little bit to think
Just
about.
needs
I
some
did
work.
want to go back. We're at the end. I did want to go back. There was a discussion about the IDs over time. Did we get a resolution of that, or are we just sort of putting up our hands?
Well, Lisa's got more this afternoon. You said, Lisa, on the ID extensions.
Well, yeah, it won't accomplish what Andrew was asking about because it's not in the right places.
The ID
To
route
affect that.
can't work as in the way that we've got here. So we've got to use a different approach to tie these together than the ID route.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
is there an action item though that we should take up? What could the modeling be to meet that business requirement of being able to write down the accession number or include the order number
Yeah,
or
I think
something
I
like
think
that?
we need to look at that alt ID and how they would link together.
Hi, this is Matt Davis from DHIT. I'm not really familiar with the back end, but I do tend to kind of dabble in the front end with end users. So in the example that you guys are mentioning about the session number, let's say, because I've had this problem before where a MA will put in an order and then maybe they put that order in wrong. So they cancel that order, but put in a new order in order to correct it. By the time it crosses systems from the EHR to the lab, there's kind of like a mismatch going on to a degree. I don't know how much that ties into what you guys are discussing now, but it feels like it ties into the fact that it's hard to tie one or the beginning part of an order to what actually happens in the end stage. So let's say outside of the first example I gave, let's say that you have a result, but it's preliminary. And then you have the final result. Does that distinction play here at all? Is that relevant at all in what you guys are discussing?
It would be a use case that falls into that. It might be more of an edge case, but it would fall into that that category.
Yeah, because I'm trying to tie the back end with what I see on the front end for what an end user would do, and especially when it comes to V2, I do am familiar with that to a degree, but the semantics you guys are discussing now, as far as the time, like the OBX and the OBR, that was a heavy play in some issues I dealt with. So just trying to find a similar ground.
Yep.
All right, we're past the top of the hour. John, you've got your next steps here. So some guidance on that section and then bringing some examples to the examples task force for approval. Is that's what your next steps are going to be?
Yep, those are my next steps. Thank you everybody for the feedback. I didn't, if anyone has any other concerns about the table, why don't you ping me afterwards, or we can chat while we're on breaks.
Sure.
It's good stuff.
Yeah, it's really awesome, John. Thanks.
All right, so we are at
Very helpful, John. Thank you.
so you've got